thank you for being here, and thank you for visiting my YouTube channel or my website, christyhodges.com. I'm really excited today because, you may be excited too, because then you don't just have to see me doing a video and you get to see other people. So I have some therapists that are coming on that I really respect, and they're well known in the OCD community, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things. But first, I want to let you know who I am. My name is Christy Hodges. I mean, if you're at my website or my YouTube channel, you probably already know that, but I'm just reinforcing that. And I am a peer support specialist. I'm certified here in the state of Colorado. I work worldwide with individuals, supporting them in helping to normalize symptoms, normalize the emotional turmoil that occurs alongside OCD. And I also do referral consultations to help connect individuals worldwide with therapists that can help do effective evidence-based treatment. I'm also the author of, oh, look, I have it right here. Pure OCD, the invisible side of obsessive compulsive disorder. So we're going to be talking a lot today about pure O and violent, sexual, blasphemous, intrusive thoughts. We're going to talk about ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. Y'all hear me talking all the time about ERP, but ACT is a really incredible therapy that is supplemental to ERP, or I don't want to talk anymore because I'll probably say something wrong and then look dumb later when Jamie's talking about it. And then we're also going to talk about addiction and substance use, because as you know, through other videos that I have done, but also in a lot of maybe your experiences there, it's just so prevalent with OCD, and I really want to try to normalize that for all of us that experience it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about peer support, because everyone is always curious what it is, and we'll get the therapist take on it too. So without further ado, I'm going to let my therapist friends over here introduce themselves. Lori, you go first.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. I am Lori Johnson, and I'm from the Denver, Colorado area. I have a small group practice specializing in addiction, substance use, and OCD spectrum. So we treat with ERP as well as ACT and CBT and anything else that anyone might need to provide a unique form of treatment to help people get better and help people in recovery.
And then we'll move along to Jamie, which, by the way, Jamie is my supervisor. So as per my credential as a peer support, I do get supervision. And Jamie has taught me so much and really helps me grow in being a peer support. So thank you, Jamie. And now introduce yourself.
So thanks, Christy. I love working with you, by the way. So my name is Jamie Valdez. I'm just outside the Boston area in Massachusetts, in a city called Worcester. And I also have a small private practice, group practice called Clearview OCD Counseling, specifically focused on obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders and treating them using evidence-based techniques. I'm also on the boards of directors for OCD Massachusetts and OCD Rhode Island, giving talks, spreading awareness, volunteering, and just generally kind of working with the International OCD Foundation to promote awareness and effective treatments and outreach for people living with OCD. So thanks for having Lori and I on here today.
Of course, it's a pleasure. And just so you know, at the recent International OCD Foundation annual conference in Washington, D.C., I had the pleasure of sitting on a panel with these two lovely ladies, as well as Patrick McGrath and Margaret Sisson, to talk about OCD and addiction. And I really believe it was effective in normalizing for so many people. So I look forward to doing that next year, hopefully. And before we kick it off, because we're going to talk about acceptance commitment therapy first, I wanted to pose a question to both of you that I know I get a lot of times when I'm working with in peer support, and that is people really, when they're living with pure O, violent sexual intrusive thoughts, one of the biggest things is they feel so alone. They feel as if this is just this rare thing, that they're the only one that has it, or they, you know, you read articles and stuff, but you really don't get the sense that there are that many people out there. And also it takes a toll on how you view yourself and the emotions surrounding it. So wanted to hear from both of you about just how common it is to have this, I don't want to like say it's a type of OCD, but you know what I'm talking about. These sorts of themes when it comes to OCD.
Yeah, so the violent, intrusive thoughts in general, we all have them to some extent, and they're pretty common. So if anyone is able to think about a random thought that they had, whether it is deemed good or bad, in your own mind, we have random thoughts all the time, and they don't have to make any sense, and they don't have to require any action. So I see the thoughts as violent or sexually intrusive thoughts as fitting kind of under that category. But what makes it so painful is that it's so distant from the person or from what they want that it's deemed a bad thought, even though clinically I try to refrain from using that language. But that's how we learn things in the world as good or bad or indifferent. And if we treat our thoughts that way, that's when it makes it difficult to push through those things. But yeah, all of us have intrusive thoughts, even people without OCD.
And I'll just chime in that unfortunately, mainstream media, as much as it's done a service by connecting people living with OCD with other people living with OCD and professionals and minimizing stigma in that way, it has also done a disservice in kind of driving home that OCD is about being a germaphobe, about being a neatnik. And while those can be some kinds of OCD, they're not the most common kinds that I see in my practice at all. I actually started becoming subspecialized in pedophile OCD, POCD, because so many of the clients who were coming in were having intrusive images or thoughts about harming a child. And this is actually a very common kind of OCD. It's one of the most painful and debilitating types. And I do want to also just kind of back this up with some science. Edna Foa, one of the top OCD researchers and developers behind the treatment techniques, did a study in 2002 and found that contamination intrusions were not actually the most commonly reported type of intrusion. They were the second most common kind, but the most common kind of intrusion in her study was aggressive intrusions, and that was 74% of the people with OCD reported that they had aggressive, violent intrusions. Sexual intrusions were 21% of the report. So if you kind of combine those numbers, it's a pretty large group of people. People can have multiple kinds of OCD, so they might have contamination intrusions as well as violent intrusions. So contamination was reported at about 56% of the people in the study. But again, those aggressive, violent thoughts were the vast majority, 74%.
Wow, I'm so glad that you said that, or that you gave the statistics here, and that's a great segue because I just also want you to know that I may mute my microphone and get up for a second because my French bulldog is snoring so loud. I think it's triggering like the camera to go to me. So if you hear that, there is not a zombie in my house. It is seriously my French bulldog. But to segue into ACT, one of the things ERP is exposure response prevention. You hear me talking about it all the time. This is effective evidence-based treatment. It is what really helped me. But y'all can definitely correct me if I'm incorrect. But I'll probably still keep saying it. Just kidding. Is that for a lot of the really, heavy, guilt, not that all things are created equal. So I just want to put that out there. But for a lot of the really heavy harm, pedophilia themes, doing exposures can really come in contrast with your values. And so that's where I believe, and I always say to people, ACT is it's a softer side softer side of ERP, and it can really help when you need to stay kind of grounded and intact in who you are, that you are a good person, and that you are, you do have great values. And so doing some of these really scary exposures that you are unable to separate from, it can really help. And so with that, I would love, Jamie, if you want to start on ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, and just explain a little bit about what it is and how it can help people.
Sure. So I think ACT can be a little divisive in the OCD community, that there are very strict ERP exposure therapy clinicians who will have nothing to do with ACT. And I like to promote ACT not as even like a supplement for exposure therapy, but as its own type of clinical approach. And I almost think of ACT and ERP as two different languages. They're saying the same thing, just in two different languages. So like one is French, one is Spanish. Some people learn French easier, some people learn Spanish better. So I offer both ERP and ACT to my clients. I tend to weave between the two. And, you know, it might end up that client A responds mostly to ACT concepts, but we do a little bit of the traditional exposure therapy. And it might be that someone else needs a very formulaic protocol of exposures and a hierarchy that they're working on, and they respond better to that. So part of my job as a clinician is figuring out like which language is my client going to speak best. And they've done studies on ACT and ERP, and they have the same treatment outcomes, because essentially they are the same treatment. They are both behavioral therapies, and they're both experiential. So someone is getting out into the world and approaching avoided material and learning to sit with discomfort. That's at the crux of both of these therapies. They also both work on the concept of expectancy violation. When I go out into the world and I touch the keypad at the gas station and I contaminate my hands, and then I don't wash my hands, and then I don't get sick the next day, well, that violated my expectation that I was going to get sick if I touched the keypad at the gas station. So both ACT and ERP work through that, as well as habituation, kind of reducing someone's response to a stimulus. I would say that the major differences between ACT and ERP are that ERP is kind of more formulaic. It follows a specific protocol. You teach it kind of, here's how you do it, ABC. Whereas ACT is more kind of metaphorical. You're teaching through descriptions of situations, or getting clients up out of the chair and engaging in different kind of behavioral experiments. And so it's a little more kind of existential than exposure therapy is, but they're both addressing the same issues, and they're both encouraging sitting with discomfort and approaching avoided material. Just to kind of describe ACT in a nutshell, a lot of people get turned off by the fact that the first word in the acronym is acceptance. You know, I don't want to accept my condition. I don't want to accept the injustices of the world. It's not actually about that. When I give my clients a definition of what acceptance in terms of ACT means, it actually means willingness. So a willingness to experience internal intrusions and discomfort. So that might be a body sensation, like a rush of adrenaline or a racing heart. It might be an intrusive thought or image. It might be just a strong urge. So allowing these intrusions to come in, and a willingness to just kind of allow them to be there. That's what acceptance means. So you're not trying to keep anxiety out. You're not trying to make happiness stay. You're understanding that these internal experiences come and go. And then the commitment therapy piece is talking about your behavior, and that your behavior, which we have a lot of control over, what your arms and legs are doing, the words coming out of your mouth, that your behavior is in line with the things that are valuable to you in life. So you might get an intrusion of, what if I stab my father tonight? And then you might get an intrusion of a rush of adrenaline, panic, and you might have an urge to then avoid your father in the kitchen and stay away from him, thinking that you'll keep him safe that way. ACT would say to let all those urges, feelings, and body sensations and intrusions be there. And there's a lot of different strategies we give clients for allowing them to be there. And then focus your behavior on moving it toward that which you value, which is your relationship with your father. So your behavior is to actually get closer to him. Maybe give him a hug in the kitchen while he's cooking dinner, because that behavior is in line with the kind of person you want to be at the end of the day. So that's ACT in a nutshell. I don't know, Lori, if you want to add anything or clarify.
Yeah, I think Clinically, the basic concept behind ACT is creative hopelessness, that both things can exist at the same time. You can be really nervous and scared and still, like what in your example, Jamie, still love your dad and want to be around him and really want to cause no harm. And that's kind of the ego dystonic part of grappling with OCD. The values portion, I think, is really a huge part of ACT being a long-term recovery process from people with OCD, because once you start participating in your exposures, and once things get better and symptoms dissipate or lessen, or only slightly lessen for some people, that you have the will and the value to keep going, because something that you believe in is bigger than the experience that you're going through right here in this moment. So ACT really allows you, and Jamie, I liked your example of speaking different languages, because ACT is really rooted in language. We have all kinds of meaning and connection to words and visual and things that we hear, or meaning behind that. And you can see that thought action fusion connection with OCD, like something happens and it must mean something. And ACT's whole purpose is to diffuse that and disconnect that, because that is not always true. It's based on ways that we've learned language and perceiving situations in our world.
And I just want to add one more thing, a little story about a client I worked with, who actually I'm still working with, but she's doing quite well now. It's, you know, in many ways maintenance treatment, but she had quote unquote failed out of numerous OCD therapies where it was all a very strict exposure therapy approach, which doesn't mean that exposure therapy doesn't work. It just wasn't working for this particular client. And one of the things that she was avoiding was eating a wide variety of foods. So she was only eating chicken sausages and chocolate bars by the time I saw her. And it had been years since she'd eaten anything other than those two things. But underneath all of that, her deeply held values were on like really nutritious foods, going to organic CSAs, you know, eating out at restaurants with her husband for date nights. Like the values underneath all the avoidant behavior were that she actually loved food and loved really healthy food. So instead of doing kind of the traditional ERP hierarchy and kind of forcing her to bite into an apple, things like that, we spent several sessions just discussing the values, the longing, what she missed about apples, why it would be important to her to get back in touch with that. And by the time she went to the farm and grabbed an apple out of the bucket, she just kind of snapped into it and loved it and has been eating apples ever since. So some of it can just be that, you know, this is a language that resonates more with some clients. I have another client right now who's doing very traditional ERP, and we are just kind of almost like going through the workbook, you know. So it's finding out what's going to work for each individual person.
Yeah. And as clinicians, I think we are catering unique treatment plans to each and every single person that we're working with in our group practices, because we get those cases where people have gone to treatment and it hasn't been effective, or have gone through 3 different therapists and they're like, something isn't working. So the very the very definition of ACT, acceptance, commitment therapy, is just accepting feelings, accepting intrusions from an OCD perspective, accepting uncomfortable sensations or things that draw your attention, then committing to what your values are, and then taking really small action steps to get you there. So really kind of meeting people where they are and having some acceptance around, like, my symptoms aren't going to dissipate tomorrow, right? My first exposure session, my exposure and response prevention treatment, it's not going to be great, but I can accept that right now because I'm working towards something bigger, or something that I really genuinely, truly value.
Well, I think what I love the most about ACT and hearing about it and learning about it from the two of you, and now that it's a little bit more up and coming, is focusing on the values that we hold, because I think that as a sufferer and working with people and supporting them as somebody who lives with OCD, that is something that really we forget. And it sounds so silly if someone's watching this and you don't understand OCD, you might be like, how could you forget your values? But when it comes to violent and sexual, really those tough, intrusive thoughts, you really do, it's hard to believe. It's that ego dystonic piece. It's hard to believe that there has got to be something about me that caused these thoughts. And so thinking that you're going to be doing a therapy that just reconnects yourself to that and can build that trust and self-compassion and self-love, because that took so long for me after treatment. And, my therapist was awesome. But it took me years and years to reconnect to that, which is why I really appreciate that this is a therapy that's coming up and really kind of like the softer side of it. And with that said, wanted to move on to something else that really does challenge our values, and that's addiction and substance use. And Lori and I have done a video here before on it. It was the first time I ever spoke out about substance use. I was a blubbering mess, crying my face off. But since then, I really have embraced, stepping out and putting kind of a face to substance use. Two things that have resonated with the two of these therapists. Number one, Lori was the first person that ever introduced me to harm reduction, which has been so helpful in my life. Being able to implement things and watch that I can actually go through with it builds so much confidence for me. And then this last conference on the panel, I was listening to something that Jamie was saying. She was talking about how addiction, substance use can be rooted in shame. And as silly and simple as that sounds, I was listening to her and it was like someone gut punched me. Because all of these years, I have been thinking to myself, I live with substance use because I am bad and I am wrong and I've made horrible decisions and I'm just a loser and I kept it quiet and I'm ashamed of it. And to hear that a lot of people live with addiction and substance use because they are really battling that internal shame, it changed my life. And if you follow me on Coffee with Chrissy, or some of my posts on Instagram at Puro Chrissy, you will know there's been a huge transformation in my life since the conference. Just being able to say, yes, I can control or I can learn to control my behaviors, but that doesn't mean that those behaviors weren't from something that hurt me so deeply in my life at some point that they were the result in a survival mechanism. So, thanks to both of you. You've been so instrumental in my life in getting me to a point where I can embrace this part of my life and not be ashamed and move forward with the right treatment. So with that said, I'd love to talk a little bit about just how prevalent addiction is and substance use when it comes to OCD. And what are some of the strategies that are used when people are really going, I'm too afraid to just go cold, turkey, sober or to stop, because as oftentimes we use it as a survival mechanism. So to have someone say, well, you have to take that away right now, people will go, and then they put themselves in danger. So Lori, could you start a little bit in this discussion?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives. One with the addiction piece or substance use disorder. I kind of use those interchangeably, and I also use that interchangeably with my clients and let them refer to what they want to refer to, because there's a lot of shame and stigma in saying, like, I have a problem, right? I have alcoholism, I have addiction versus substance use, like allowing people to work through some of that shame in that way by letting them own their own language around it. So I'm going to talk about it from the addiction substance use disorder realm, and then also kind of the overlap with OCD and ERP treatment, along with struggling with substance use or coping in that way. So what we know about, there's a lot of lack of evidence for research in this area because the communities have been separated from each other in a lot of ways. And now we're starting to see emerge to bridge that gap a little bit more. But in informal numbers, say about 24-25% of people who struggle with substance use disorder also have an anxiety disorder and or OCD. So pretty prevalent number. And this is just based off of a lot of treatment centers who are treating addiction or substance use disorder, and also asking and doing a little bit further assessment to see if people are also struggling with OCD. So we need more research in this area. And Chrissy, I think maybe you remember someone brought this up in our discussion on shame and stigma at the International OCD Conference. So it's something that needs more research. So it is normal. It's normal for any of us to cope with anything. And when I talk about the realm of addiction, I'm not only talking about alcohol and drugs, I'm talking about food and sex and shopping and all the things that really connect on our reward circuitry, right? It could even be coffee, caffeine. I have my coffee cup right here. Coffee, caffeine, Rockstar, energy drinks. Sometimes people become addicted to exercise and all kinds of things. We're really talking about the reward in the brain. So as clinicians, we constantly talk about coping tools and coping strategies. Those are doing very similar rewards, but not pinging on something that is going to be either psychologically dependent for a person, psychologically addictive, or chemically addictive and becoming chemically dependent on something. When we're coping, those dependencies aren't there. They are on a smaller level, rewarding the brain in that way. Sorry, I'm getting a little caught up on my words. My mind is working faster than my mouth is. So it is very common. And the harm reduction model that we've talked about can be really dangerous for some people. So I'm going to urge anyone who's watching this and is really struggling with alcohol or some other really addictive substances that you really do need an evaluation from a mental health professional, because withdrawal from some substances can be very dangerous. It is difficult for some people to implement a harm reduction model themselves. So just reaching out and making sure that you're getting the right resources for that. There are a lot of things that we aren't talking about in the addiction community, but it's so important to have conversations like this. And Chrissy, I know that you spoke on panels and are trying to get the word out there. And I'm so honored that you shared your story for the first time to your viewers and to the people who you're working really hard for. It's invaluable.
Sorry, that was my dog. That was not me.
I think he agrees.
Agree.
I also just wanted to say, Chrissy, that, I'm bowled over by your bravery and your generosity in sharing your story. OCD, as you know, especially the, aggressive sexual violent intrusions, is an incredibly stigmatizing and isolating disorder, more so than some other mental health disorders where we have a little more societal tolerance and acceptance around them. But OCD is particularly isolating. It makes people think that they're the only ones having these thoughts. They're the only ones coping in these ways. So for you to put such a public face on this, and also on the stigma of addiction and self-medicating, it's going to allow a lot of people to kind of come out of the closets on that and be able to share their own stories and feel less ashamed. And, as you were talking about earlier with shame, that can often be at the root of what starts the whole self-medicating process, but then it just builds and builds and becomes compounded on itself, because then somebody's ashamed about the actual ways that they're coping. So viewing this as something that there is help for, there's a lot of different types of recovery models for addiction, but also that this is not a character defect. This is not about somebody's, it's not about who they are. It's about behaviors they're engaging in to try to feel better in some way. And I appreciate that Lori, made sure to underscore that harm reduction, while it's something that Lori and I are passionate about, there's a lot of evidence that it works for reducing harmful, addictive or self-medicating behaviors. It is something that should be done in conjunction with a licensed professional who can be monitoring everything. And addiction and substance use is actually what brought Lori and I together. That and OCD, we were, even though we're across the country from one another, we talk every week because we were frustrated that people with OCD spectrum disorders were getting X'd out of treatment if they were self-medicating, that they couldn't engage in the exposure work. And it's a passion of ours to not exclude people from treatment because they're self-harming or self-medicating or because they're not motivated. We want to help everyone living with OCD, not just kind of the easy cases that tick the, the 4 boxes of are you ready for treatment. So Lori and I are also working right now on founding Real Recovery, which is going to be a training institute for helping other clinicians become more comfortable treating complicated cases where there are a lot of things going on. It's not just your classic OCD case. And so for more information on that, you can check out realrecovery.org.
Yeah. I maybe should clarify a little bit more about what harm reduction is really briefly. It is a therapeutic modality, really kind of under a cognitive behavioral therapy, and just taking approaches to simply help people reduce harm. So a few examples of that might be if you're drinking 2 bottles of wine every night, and this is one of the alcohol is one of those the substances that would need some medical care and some appropriate detox, but maybe you lessen by 1 glass. So you drink 1 bottle and, open the next bottle, but you don't drink the whole thing. There's still approximately a glass of wine left.
Or maybe pour it down the sink so it's not even available.
Or you pour it down the sink so it's not available. Or you go into the store and buy only that thing that you need, right? Maybe someone is really struggling with drinking and driving and they just need to stop that for right now. So maybe they would give their keys to someone else or their license so that they can't buy something. Maybe someone reduces the amount of partying that they're doing with friends or buy smaller rations of different drugs. Maybe that was the wrong word, rations, but maybe if someone's using an 8-ball, maybe they only buy like smaller teeners instead to reduce the amount that they are using. The really big cusp between true addiction and coping is that a person with true addiction is really going to struggle with doing harm reduction on their own. And they're going to have constant failed attempts versus someone who is coping. They're going to slowly reduce the amount of substances that they're using so that they can actually feel what's going on. And for those of you who are struggling with OCD, that means you are going to experience your intrusions more. It's an exposure to even do that and having some preparedness and readiness around that. But really, first and foremost is knowing that you can do OCD and substance use disorder work together. You're going to need a really skilled clinician to help you do that because you are going to have 2 relapse prevention plans. One around your exposure and response prevention, and the other around the recovery and the safety around not drinking or not drugging or not overeating, because our whole goal as therapists is to be holistic and to have you return into your life and living your values and doing everything on a balance level. There is no perfection in that, but as soon as you stop drinking and that's lessened, guess what's going to come up? OCD. So we have this kind of delicate balance on having both relapse prevention plans in mind to help people with recovery. But you're not alone. Like, this isn't, your thoughts are not obscure. We hear them all the time. Some surprise us, but we're not surprised that it's there at all. It's just kind of interesting how they come up and how the human mind works in general. But you're not alone. There's other people out there who don't have access to Google, or who do Google this and then think like something else is wrong, or who look up the amount that you're supposed to be drinking and say like, oh my gosh, I better not report that to anybody because it's better to have 2 glasses of wine than be drinking 6 a night. what is someone going to think about me? But if you're not talking about it, that's increasing the shame that you have about your own recovery in some way. So you're not alone. And there are things other than ERP, and there are clinicians who understand that drinking is a coping strategy. And for some people, it can be a true addiction.
And I also just want to plug that Lori and I are supporters of 12-step programs too. If that's something that is working for a client, we as clinicians have no problem, supporting kind of some of those more traditional methods. We just want people to know that there's more than that available, and each person in their recovery from OCD and addiction is going to be unique. And it might be that the 12 steps work for their alcoholism, but not for their compulsive spending. And so it might even be that for that specific person, we're having to pull in creative interventions. But I did just want to say that if 12 steps are working for a client, or it sounds like, something that they want to explore further, we're happy to give them access to, 12-step groups and materials on that as well.
And that's been part of your role is peer support. Like that's what we rely on for you as a peer support specialist to help reinforce his recovery overall, whether that's OCD or anything else. Like I think that you're pretty well versed in that and working with our clients too.
And I think this is a great segue into talking a little bit about peer support to wrap this up. I 100% agree. Harm reduction isn't going to work for everybody. 12 steps isn't going to work for everybody. But I wanted to give you an example of how it worked for me really quickly, because we are going to talk about peer support, and that is about lived experience. I'll just tell you a couple of the things that I implemented, and I was my brain told me, there's no way you can quit drinking. It's a coping mechanism for me, an unhealthy one at times. But I thought to myself, well, I can't just quit. There's no possible way. And then in doing that, I'm putting myself in danger of where there's nothing in between. It's either this or that. And so when I found out about harm reduction, I looked at it a lot like I look at ERP. I can commit to ERP. When I want to do ERP, when I'm bombarded with intrusive thoughts, I commit to doing it that day, twice a day for however long. And I go through with it no matter what, because I've made that commitment to myself. So with harm reduction, I do that as well. Some days I fail, some days are amazing. But the thing is that as long as I am implementing it and succeeding, that's just as great as the actual harm reduction. It makes me feel good that I can assert control when I feel out of control, when that shame inside of me has just taken me for, a balloon ride. So a couple examples of harm reduction that I do, they're not super drastic, but they help. When I go out, which isn't often because I'm a homebody, but when I go out, I will implement you do not drive if you have over one drink. So that absolutely gives me that limit of, okay, well then if I'm going to have 2 drinks, then I'm going to Uber. And so it just puts a cap on it, and I commit to that. Another harm reduction strategy for me is drink a full jar of water in between each drink at night. That one's my favorite because it really does slow things down. It slows the urges and the cravings down a lot, and I stay really hydrated. And so by the time I go to bed, I don't want to drink anymore, and I don't wake up at all feeling different. Another harm reduction strategy is boyfriend Sean likes to have a beer with his lunch on Saturday and Sundays. And what I started noticing is I would go, well, if he's having a beer, I'm going to have a glass of wine. Well, he has 1 beer. I can't just have 1 glass of wine without thinking, well, I'll just have a little bit more and a little bit more. So harm reduction plan on the weekends is I do not have any alcohol before 5 o'clock. And I rarely drink anyway in the day anyway, but something like that, if he's having one, I think to myself, well, if he does, I can see it's okay, but I have to understand where I am versus where he is. So those are just a few different strategies and I have several of them, but that really, really work for me. So yeah, with that said, we're going to talk about peer support really quickly because you've heard me talk about it all the time anyway, but I wanted to get the clinical perspective of it, because there is a lot of controversy when it comes to the medical model and the recovery model. And a lot of old school, I hate to say old school, but a lot of old school clinicians and people that have been in the field for a long time think that peer supporters are not effective, and they think that we're not professionals. Peer support is using your lived experience to meet somebody where they're at on their recovery journey. Support them where they're at. I'm not here to give advice. I'm not here to give therapy. I'm there to meet you. With OCD, it's so important because there are days when you cannot get in touch with a therapist. You don't want to go to a crisis center. It's not to that point yet, but you don't know what to do because you can't talk to your family and friends about, thoughts about pedophilia, or thoughts about, did I turn gay, or thoughts about, if I'm thinking weird thoughts about Jesus. So a peer supporter is somebody that can meet you right there and go, oh gosh, I get it, and help normalize what you're going through and support you wherever you're at. I work with clients worldwide. It's a dream job for me to be able to be there with people in their at their worst time, and sometimes at their best time, to celebrate with them. So it is evidence-based. I highly encourage you, if you're looking for peer support, please find out their credentials. Are they certified? Have they been trained? Are they being supervised? Do they keep up on continued education? Don't exchange money with people that don't have all 4 of those qualifications. So with that, Lori, would you like to start and talk about the importance of peer support?
Yeah, let's see, we met like maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I started peer support in my practice then. And what I have noticed is that people feel less shame. People feel, whether they're working with you or with any other peer support specialist, they feel less shame. They seek recovery faster. They end up disclosing to more people about what they're struggling with. And normally that's like a family or a partner or someone who's going to help them be more effective in their life. It is also a great opportunity for someone to have support outside of therapy, because especially in my community here in Denver, we're a little mecca of OCD therapists, like you always say, or OCD treatment providers. And we're the only ones. And we're dealing with people in the entire state and some of the neighboring states, if people are licensed, to really help them. So our schedules are sometimes super full, and to get someone in at the last minute is really difficult. And it also allows people to, as you provide to clients, what I've been doing is creating the exposure plans, creating hierarchies, or whatever a client needs to talk about that and talk about all the nuances, and then being able to hand that over to you to help them with the guidelines, so that a person doesn't forget, because they're so anxious and they don't want to do the exposures, but they know they have to or need to or want to in some cases, and having you be able to implement that with them and be right there as a peer. And also the fact that you've gone through your own treatment and know what that's like and are in that recovery process yourself and can help them from that perspective.
And a lot of people, I think, they meet me and they go, oh my gosh, she looks normal. Not necessarily as normal, but either way, people will say, I'm meeting a real-time person who's done this, who was in the depths, who almost didn't survive. And look, if she can do it, I can do it too. That's the best thing I love about my job, is being able to say, oh my gosh, I didn't think I could do it. Like, I needed a peer support when I was going through therapy, and there wasn't any then. But being able to show somebody, look, I am not special. I am not different. If I can do it, you can do it too. So Jamie, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to go back to what I said earlier in our talk, that, this is such a stigmatizing and isolating disorder, that having that peer support component is critical for reducing the shame and stigma and allowing people to reach out for help. It takes on average 7 to 12 years before someone with OCD even reaches out for help. 25% of people with OCD have some kind of substance or alcohol use problem. And that's only the ones who are willing to admit it. So 1 out of every 4 people that you meet who has OCD probably is also self-medicating or addicted in some way. And that just compounds the shame and stigma and isolation even further. So I believe, and I don't have statistics on this part, but I believe that you're often the first person that people come into contact with, Chrissy, that they say, you know, this is someone who's not going to call 911 on me. This is somebody who's going to get it. This is somebody who's not a mandated reporter, who's going to understand the thoughts I'm having in my head about my partner, my kids, my dog, about hurting myself, but I don't want to, you know. And so they're going to reach out to somebody who they trust, who they think, you know, is the face of OCD, who can say, I get this, I've been there before. And then you're almost like that, you know, center cog in the wheel, that then you're connecting people with other resources, with psychiatrists and behavior therapists and, you know, just a ton of other resources out there. And so you know, I can hardly imagine a treatment world where there aren't peer support specialists. We need you so badly for connecting people to the supports that they need, and also just for giving them someone to talk to who gets it. It's kind of like if you think about, you know, if you had a problem going on in your life and you wanted to talk to one of your best friends about it, and one of your best friends does a lot of empathic, reflective listening, like, I hear you, that sucks. And your other best friend gives really good advice. Well, sometimes you're going to best friend A and sometimes you're going to best friend B. And sometimes people want that really directive behavior therapy to work on X, Y, and Z. Sometimes they just want to know that someone gets it and has been through it before and survived it. So I love what you do. I'm deeply appreciative for it. Lori and I couldn't do the work that we do without peer specialists. And, you know, keep on doing what you're doing. We need it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I love that description about friend A and B. I'm going to steal that and use it. I'll put Jamie Valdez.
Yeah.
So with that said,
trademark that, I think.
With that said, if you have any more questions about anything that we are talking about, ACT, addiction and substance use, peer support, feel free to reach out to me at ocd.chrissy@gmail.com or at my website, chrissyhodges.com. And if you have questions specific for Jamie or Lori, you can also reach out to me and I will absolutely forward them on. We're going to have some final thoughts from Jamie and Lori, and then we'll wrap up. Lori, would you like to start?
Yeah. My final thought is I think we've covered a lot of really cool things, and opening up the door for people to get various kinds of treatment or other things to just help them be more effective or more present in life as well. I guess one of my last thoughts is more around therapists, especially dealing with violent, intrusive, or sexual thoughts or pedophilia thoughts around children or violence or aggression. It's really important for you as a client or you as a therapist, kind of talking to both people now, as a client being an advocate for yourself and saying, no, this is OCD, because there are many times where treatment providers aren't as well skilled and go into kind of some of the pathology of like, oh, this must be a person that's going to harm people or really enjoys these thoughts. So as a client, advocate for yourself. This is OCD, right? Maybe sometimes you share the video or share something that you found online to say, this is not inappropriate. This is what I think I'm going through. And then a message for clinicians is just asking a few other questions to really get to the root of that, because just because someone's having these thoughts doesn't mean that they are actually true. I just wanted to kind of make that message known, to give clients some advocacy and to give clinicians some advocacy to learn a little bit more about this so that they can dispatch people to the right treatment providers through referrals.
So needed. I'm glad you said that. What about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I'll just plug that there's hope, there's recovery, and there's a lot of treatment techniques, and there's stuff still developing, and there's a lot of alternative therapies that are starting to be shown to be effective. So I would say, you know, if you've been engaging in treatment and you're not getting traction, look around. You know, maybe there's a different approach that would work for you or a different setting. You know, there's so many things available now that weren't available a while back. And, you know, even just with like ACT coming more into the forefront now, that's an example, but there's intensive outpatient programs, there's various online groups, all different options for peer support that way. There's a lot of free resources on the internet through the IOCDF's website. You know, there's, you know, Lori and I both have blogs where we write about topics related to this. So if what you're doing isn't working and you're getting hopeless, keep going, just shift gears and look elsewhere.
Well, I just want to thank both of you. You are both inspiring, wonderful individuals in the OCD community. We're so lucky to have you. And also just thank you for being here. And thank you for always being there for me. So selfishly.
Well, thank you for having us. It's an honor to be a part of this, and we feel the same way about you. We're all in the same community, and yes, thank you for having us on today.
Thank you, Chrissy.
So just a few things to wrap up. I know that we're talking a lot about therapy, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, I can't afford therapy, and I'm not in a position for therapy. Maybe my parents aren't supporting therapy at this point. I want to give you a couple other things you can look at. There are workbooks. They aren't designed to be ERP therapists, but they are created by ERP therapists or OCD therapists to help. The mindfulness workbook for OCD by John Hirschfield. They're all three Johns, by the way. Freedom from Obsessive Compulsive Disorder by Jonathan Grayson. Overcoming OCD by Jonathan Abramowitz. These are all three books that I would highly recommend for starting to get a feel of what looking at OCD different is going to be. I also want to plug Kimberly Quinlan is a therapist in California, and she has just launched this huge project called ERP School. It is I had it written down, but I don't have it. I believe it's 5 hours, 18 videos. It is not ERP. However, she is an OCD therapist. She walks you through what ERP is in a way that you can help try to start things on your own. Again, it's not therapy, but it is very intensive and gives you a lot of information. Go to cbtschool.com. It's Kimberly Quinlan. She is amazing therapist. And, you know, again, it's not therapy, but she really did work hard on being able to provide this for people who cannot afford ERP therapy, but just want somewhat of an introduction or kind of a self-guided. I also want to plug Stuart Ralph of the OCD Stories. You probably already know who he is. Everybody does, right, Lori? Stuart Ralph has a 6-part summit webinar coming up for therapists. Unfortunately, it's not for those of us with OCD, but for therapists with 6 experts in the field. I can't name them all off right now, but it's their webinars on learning how to treat OCD, probably some talk about complicated cases with OCD. ACT will be talked about, all kinds of things. I highly recommend if you were a therapist and you were treating OCD and you just want to learn more, or if you're thinking about treating OCD and you want to learn more, absolutely go to the OCDstories.com, and it is, I can't remember what it's called, but it's a summit he has coming up and a webinar on OCD treatment. So with that said, as usual, thank you for being here. I hope that it was helpful. If you are looking for peer support or referrals for therapists, please go to ocd.chrissy is that right? Yeah, ocd.chrissy@gmail.com or my website at chrissyhodges.com. And I will see you next time.